The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trading post, its rays creating shimmering mirages on the horizon. Jake Morrison adjusted his worn leather hat, the sweat already beading on his weathered forehead despite the early morning hour. At 32, he had the kind of face that told stories, deep lines carved by years of squinting against desert winds, a jaw set firm by countless lonely nights on the range. The trading post reeked of whiskey, tobacco, and desperation. Men huddled around makeshift tables, their voices low as they conducted business that wouldn't see the light of respectable society. Jake's boots echoed against the wooden floor as he approached the counter where Samuel Hartley, the post's owner, stood counting coins with greasy fingers. "Morrison?" Hartley nodded, his gap-toothed smile revealing years of poor decisions. "Heard you're looking for help at that ranch of yours." Jake's jaw tightened. The Double M Ranch had been his father's dream, passed down with nothing but debt and broken promises. 3 hands had quit in the past month, unable to handle the isolation and his demanding nature. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and Jake couldn't do it all alone, though God knows he'd tried. "Depends on what you got," Jake replied, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over cattle and wind. Hartley's eyes gleamed with the look of a man about to make a profitable deal. He gestured toward the back corner where a young Apache woman sat on a wooden crate, her dark eyes fixed on the floor. She couldn't have been more than 19, with long black hair braided down her back and traditional Apache clothing that had seen better days. Her hands were bound with rough rope, but her posture remained dignified despite her circumstances. "Name's Ayana," Hartley said, pronouncing it wrong. "Means eternal blossom, or some such nonsense. She's strong, can work from dawn to dusk. Apache women know how to survive in this land better than most men." Jake studied the young woman, noting the way she held herself despite her situation. There was something in her bearing that spoke of inner strength, of a spirit not yet broken. Her dark eyes briefly met his, and he saw neither defeat nor plea, just a quiet assessment, as if she were measuring him just as carefully as he was measuring her. "What's her story?" Jake asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "Captured during a raid last month. Her people can't pay the ransom. She's yours for $100. Feed her, house her, and you got yourself a worker who won't run off to the next town for better wages." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd seen slavery in his younger days during the war, had watched good men die fighting against it. This wasn't the same thing legally. The government called it indenture now, but the stench of human ownership was unmistakable. "I need help with the ranch work," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cooking, cleaning, tending to the animals. Nothing else." Hartley shrugged. "Your business is your business, Morrison. She speaks some English, understands more. Been to the mission school before her people pulled her out." Jake pulled out a worn leather pouch, counting out the bills slowly. Each one felt heavier than it should, weighted with the gravity of what he was doing. He told himself it was practical. He needed help. She needed shelter. But the knot in his stomach suggested his conscience wasn't buying the rationalization. As the money changed hands, the young woman, Ayana, finally looked up at him fully. Her eyes were the color of rich earth after rain, and they held depths that suggested she understood far more than anyone gave her credit for. She stood gracefully, her movements fluid despite the rope bindings. "Can you cut those?" Jake asked Hartley, nodding toward her bound hands. "Your property now," Hartley replied, tossing Jake a small knife. "Your rules." Jake caught the knife, the metal cold against his palm. He walked over to Ayana, noting how she didn't flinch as he approached. Up close, he could see the subtle signs of her heritage, the high cheekbones, the way she carried herself with an innate connection to the land around them. "I'm going to cut the rope," he said quietly. "You understand English?" She nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face. Jake sliced through the rough hemp, watching as she rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed the skin. Red marks stood out against her bronze complexion, evidence of how long she'd been bound. "My name is Jake Morrison," he said, tucking the knife into his belt. "I have a ranch about 10 miles from here. You'll have your own room, 3 meals a day, and I expect hard work in return. Nothing more, nothing less." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the musical quality of her native tongue, even when speaking English. "I am Ayana of the Chiricahua Apache. I understand your words." Her English was clearer than Hartley had suggested, with only the slightest accent. Jake nodded, unsure of what else to say. The weight of what he'd just done pressed down on him like the oppressive desert heat. "We should go," he said finally. "It's a long ride to the ranch." As they walked toward his horse and the small wagon he'd brought for supplies, Jake could feel the eyes of the other men in the trading post following them. Some looked curious, others disapproving, and a few showed expressions that made his blood run cold. He'd made a decision that would change both their lives, though he had no idea how profoundly. The wagon ride back to the Double M Ranch passed in near silence. Ayana sat beside him on the bench, her back straight and her eyes taking in every detail of the landscape. Jake found himself stealing glances at her, wondering what she was thinking as they traveled through territory that was both her ancestral homeland and now her prison. The desert stretched endlessly around them, broken only by towering saguaro cacti and the occasional cluster of palo verde trees. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Jake had always found peace in this harsh beauty, but today it felt different, charged with uncertainty and the weight of responsibility for another human being. As they crested a small rise, the Double M Ranch came into view. It wasn't much to look at. A modest adobe house, a weathered barn, corrals that needed repair, and a windmill that squeaked in the constant breeze. But it was home, the only place Jake had ever truly belonged. "This is it," he said, more to break the silence than to inform her. Ayana nodded, her gaze taking in every detail of what would now be her new reality. Jake wondered what she saw when she looked at his struggling ranch. Opportunity, prison, or simply another chapter in a story that had already taken too many unexpected turns. As they pulled up to the house, Jake realized he had no idea what came next. He'd bought her services, but he'd also bought responsibility for another human being. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of change. 3 weeks had passed since Ayana's arrival at the Double M Ranch, and Jake Morrison was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about strength and resilience. Each morning before dawn, he would find her already awake, preparing simple but nourishing meals from the basic supplies he kept on hand. She worked without complaint, tending to tasks he'd struggled with for months. But it was the small things that caught him off guard. The way she spoke quietly to the horses while brushing them down, her voice carrying a soothing quality that seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. How she moved through the desert landscape as if she were part of it, never disturbing the delicate ecosystem around the ranch buildings. The respect she showed for everything, from the smallest lizard to the ancient saguaro that stood sentinel near the house. This particular morning found Jake repairing fence posts in the north pasture, the Arizona sun already promising another scorching day, despite the early hour. Sweat stung his eyes as he struggled with a post that refused to sit properly in the rocky ground. His frustration was building toward one of his legendary outbursts when he heard soft footsteps approaching. "The earth here is angry," Ayana said, her voice carrying easily across the still morning air. Jake paused in his hammering, turning to look at her. She stood a few feet away, holding a cup of coffee and studying the problematic fence post with the same intensity she brought to everything. "What do you mean?" he asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You fight the land instead of working with it," she explained, moving closer to examine the hole he'd been digging. "See how the rocks lean? The water flows this way during the storms. If you place the post here instead." She indicated a spot about 2 feet to the left. "The earth will help hold it steady." Jake studied the area she'd indicated, noting details he'd missed in his frustration. The subtle depression in the ground, the way small stones had naturally arranged themselves, signs he should have recognized after years of working this land. "Your people, the Apache, you know this desert well," he said, more statement than question. "This was our home for many generations," Ayana replied simply. "My grandfather taught me to read the signs the earth gives us. He said the land speaks to those who listen." As they worked together to relocate the fence post, Jake found himself observing Ayana more closely. Her movements were economical, purposeful. She wasted no energy, used her body's leverage to maximum advantage. The post that had been fighting him slid into the new location with minimal effort. "How did you learn to work with wood and metal?" Jake asked as they tamped down the earth around the newly placed post. "At the mission school," she said, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "They taught us to work with the white man's tools, to live in the white man's way. They said it would help us survive in the changing world." "But you left the school?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her hands still working to secure the post. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with memory. "My younger brother became sick at the school. They would not let me take him to our medicine woman. They said their God would heal him if we prayed hard enough." She paused, her knuckles white as she gripped the fence rail. "He died calling for our mother in Apache. They buried him in their cemetery with their prayers, far from the sacred places of our people." Jake felt something twist in his chest. He'd heard stories about the mission schools, about children torn from their families in the name of civilization. But hearing it from someone who'd lived it, seeing the pain that still lingered in her dark eyes, made it real in a way that newspaper accounts never could. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "After that, my family came to take me home. But the world had already changed too much. The buffalo were gone. The cavalry pushed us onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. When the raid came," she trailed off, turning back to the fence. They worked in silence for a while, the shared rhythm of physical labor creating an unexpected companionship. Jake found himself studying Ayana's profile as she worked, noting the way she unconsciously tilted her face toward the morning sun, the graceful line of her neck, the small scar above her left eyebrow that spoke of childhood adventures. "What was your family like?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Ayana smiled for the first time since he'd known her, the expression transforming her face completely. "My father was a warrior, but also a storyteller. He could make the smallest children laugh with his tales of coyotes' tricks. My mother," her smile widened, "my mother could track a butterfly through a thunderstorm and never lose its trail. She taught me about plants, about healing, about the old ways." "You miss them." "Every breath," she admitted. "But missing them is like missing the color of sunset or the sound of rain. It is part of who I am now." As the morning progressed, Jake found himself sharing details of his own life he rarely spoke about. His father's dream of building something lasting in this harsh country, the war that had taken his older brother and left him the sole heir to dreams too big for one man, the loneliness that had settled into his bones like desert dust. "You speak of your ranch as a burden," Ayana observed as they moved on to the next section of fence. "But I see how you touch the wood when you think no one is watching, how you stand differently when you look out over your cattle. This place is part of your spirit. Jake paused in his work, hammer suspended mid-swing. He'd never thought of it that way, but her words rang true. The double M wasn't just property, it was his father's legacy, his brother's memory, his own stubborn refusal to admit defeat. Maybe, he said finally, but it's killing me. I can't do it all alone, and good help is hard to find out here. Perhaps, Ayana said thoughtfully, you are looking for the wrong kind of help. Before Jake could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer on the horizon, and Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized them. Tom Bradley and his sons, Pete and Jimmy, neighbors who'd made no secret of their disapproval of Jake's arrangement with Ayana. "Morrison!" Tom Bradley called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet away. At 55, he was a hard man made harder by the desert, with pale eyes that held the cold certainty of someone who'd never questioned his own righteousness. "We need to talk." Jake set down his hammer and walked toward the riders, positioning himself subtly between them and Ayana. "Tom, boys, what brings you out here?" "You know damn well what brings us," Pete Bradley snarled. At 28, he was a younger, meaner version of his father, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Word's gotten around about your domestic situation." "I don't see how my ranch hands are any of your business," Jake replied evenly, though his hand drifted toward the Colt at his hip. "Ranch hand?" Jimmy Bradley laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "That what you're calling it? That Apache squaw is living in your house, Morrison. People are starting to talk." "People should mind their own damn business," Jake shot back, his voice hardening. Tom Bradley leaned forward in his saddle, his face flushing red beneath his hat brim. "When it comes to mixing races and corrupting Christian values, it becomes everyone's business. That savage has no place in a decent white man's home." Something dangerous flickered in Jake's eyes. "Careful, Tom. You're on my land, talking about someone under my protection." "Protection?" Pete Bradley's hand moved to rest on his gun butt. "Is that what they're calling it now?" The tension ratcheted higher, 3 men on horseback facing 1 man on foot. But Jake Morrison had fought in the war, had faced down rustlers and claimed jumpers. He didn't back down easy. "I think it's time you boys moved along," Jake said quietly, the kind of quiet that came before storms. "We're trying to help you, Morrison," Tom Bradley said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Send that Apache back where she belongs before you bring shame on yourself and trouble to this whole valley." "The only trouble I see," Jake replied, "is 3 men with too much time on their hands and not enough sense to use it productively." Behind him, he could sense Ayana watching, could feel the weight of her attention. He wondered what she made of this confrontation, whether she saw it as protection or possession. The distinction mattered more than he cared to examine. "This isn't over, Morrison," Tom Bradley warned as he gathered his reins. "People won't stand for this kind of behavior indefinitely." As the 3 riders departed, Jake watched them go with a growing sense of unease. He'd made enemies before, but the Bradleys had influence in town, friends who shared their views. Trouble was coming. He could feel it in the desert wind, like the promise of rain. "They will return," Ayana said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "Maybe, but this is my land, and you're under my protection. That means something." Ayana studied his profile for a long moment. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why what? Why do you protect me? I am nothing to you, a purchase, a convenience. Why risk the anger of your neighbors?" Jake was quiet for a long time, watching the dust cloud raised by the departing riders fade into the shimmering distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of realization that surprised them both. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And maybe Maybe because for the first time in years, this place doesn't feel quite so lonely. As they walked back toward the ranch house, the desert sun climbing higher into the endless blue sky, both Jake and Ayanna carried with them the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted between them. The transaction that had brought them together was evolving into something neither had expected, the fragile beginning of mutual respect and understanding. But with change came danger, and the dust cloud on the horizon served as a reminder that not everyone would approve of the transformation taking place at the Double M Ranch. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, but would end with Jake Morrison questioning everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and the woman who had quietly revolutionized his existence over the past 2 months. Jake's younger sister, Mary Catherine, had always possessed an impeccable sense of timing, usually the worst possible timing. Her elegantly penned correspondence, delivered by a travel-worn messenger, announced her intention to visit the Double M Ranch, to meet this woman you've taken into your household. The subtext was clear. Mary Catherine was coming to investigate, to pass judgment, and quite possibly to stage an intervention. "She's coming here?" Ayanna asked, having observed Jake's increasingly tense expression as he read the letter for the 3rd time. "My sister," Jake confirmed, setting the letter down on the kitchen table with the care of someone handling a live rattlesnake. "Mary Catherine lives in Tucson with her husband, owns the largest mercantile in the territory, and has opinions about everything." Ayanna nodded thoughtfully, her hands continuing their work kneading bread dough. Over the past weeks, she'd transformed Jake's basic survival cooking into meals that actually nourished both body and soul. More than that, she'd begun to make the ranch house feel like a home, rather than simply a place where a lonely man waited for each day to end. "You are worried about what she will think of me," Ayanna observed. It wasn't a question. Jake ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that had become habitual when he was wrestling with complicated emotions. "Mary Catherine she's a good woman, but she sees the world in very clear lines. Black and white, right and wrong. She won't understand. What we have here..." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine too closely. Over the past 2 months, their relationship had evolved far beyond employer and employee. They worked together with an easy synchronization, anticipated each other's needs, shared meals filled with increasingly comfortable conversation. Jake had taught Ayanna to read his cattle brand records. She had shown him how to identify edible plants that grew wild on his property. They'd become partners in ways that transcended the legal document that had brought them together. "She'll arrive tomorrow evening," Jake said finally. "I just want you to know that whatever she says, whatever attitude she brings, it doesn't change anything here." Ayanna studied his face with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "And what exactly is here, Jake Morrison?" Before Jake could answer, or even figure out what his answer might be, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But this time, it wasn't the Bradley clan come to cause trouble. A lone rider approached the house, and Jake recognized the official bearing of Marshal David Torres from town. "Marshal," Jake greeted him, stepping out onto the front porch. "What brings you out to the Double M?" Torres was a fair man, one of the few lawmen Jake had met who seemed genuinely interested in justice rather than simply maintaining the status quo. His weathered face wore an expression of reluctant duty as he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "Jake, I need to speak with you about your Apache woman." "Her name is Ayanna," Jake said carefully. "And what about her?" "There's been talk in town. Some folks are saying she's not here of her own free will. There are questions about the legality of your arrangement." Jake felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "I have the papers." Everything was done legally through Samuel Hartley. I know that, Torres said, holding up a placating hand. But there's pressure from some influential folks to investigate whether this constitutes slavery. The territorial governor is getting involved. Slavery was abolished, Jake pointed out. Yes, but there are gray areas around indenture agreements, especially involving Native Americans. I need to speak with her, Jake, privately, to confirm she's here willingly and being treated properly. Jake's first instinct was to refuse, to protect Ayanna from questions that might force her to relive painful memories. But he also knew that cooperation was their best defense against the mounting pressure from people like the Bradleys. I'll ask her, Jake said finally. But I won't force her to speak if she doesn't want to. Jake explains the situation to Ayanna, who responds confidently, saying she will speak with the marshal and not hide the truth about her life. After a lengthy conversation with Marshal Torres, he tells Jake that Ayanna is intelligent, articulate, and clear about her choice to stay, affirming that Jake treats her with respect. However, the marshal warns Jake about the trouble some people might cause using their arrangement as ammunition. Later, Ayanna reveals that she feels safe at the Double M Ranch, the first place since her brother's death where she's felt protected. She thanks Jake, but then asks him a crucial question. How will he introduce her to his sister? Will she be his servant or something more? Jake is struck by the question and admits he doesn't know what to call their relationship, but it's more than just employer and employee. Ayanna shares a word from her language, Shichu, meaning the one who completes the circle, and suggests it describes their connection. She explains that Jake saved her in ways unrelated to money or legality, and that she has done the same for him. As the sun sets, Ayanna expresses her gratitude for the hope Jake has restored in her, hope for kindness, common ground, and a better future. Jake realizes his life has changed, and for the first time he feels ready to face the judgment to come with honesty, recognizing that some people are worth risking everything to protect. Jake's sister, Mary Catherine Morrison Whitfield, arrives at the Double M Ranch, bringing with her both family warmth and sharp business instincts. A successful entrepreneur from Tucson, she comes expecting to find her brother making a fool of himself over a pretty face, but instead discovers a genuine partnership that has transformed both Jake and his struggling ranch. During dinner, Mary Catherine conducts a subtle interrogation of Ayanna, probing her background and role in the household. Ayanna responds with dignity and honesty, explaining that while she was purchased, Jake treated her with respect from the first day, giving her fair wages, her own room, and most importantly, choice. She reveals that Marshal Torres had offered her safe passage anywhere she wished to go, but she chose to stay because she had found family, not bound by blood, but by mutual respect and shared purpose. Jake confirms that Ayanna has made him a better man and the ranch a better place, stating it was the best decision he'd ever made. Mary Catherine, initially skeptical, begins to see the genuine bond between them and how their partnership has made both stronger. Mary Catherine then reveals her true reason for visiting. Territorial officials are considering legislation that would invalidate indenture contracts involving Native Americans. The arrangement between Jake and Ayanna would need regularization, meaning marriage, or they would be forced to separate. The government sees only three possibilities for their situation: slavery, prostitution, or scandal, with marriage being the only respectable option. That evening on the porch, Jake and Ayanna have the conversation they've been avoiding. Ayanna expresses her desire to choose her own path rather than be traded like property again. When Jake asks what she'd say if a man told her he'd fallen in love with her, she responds that she would need to know he understood the difference between love and gratitude, between choosing someone and being chosen by circumstances. Jake assures her that given 100 chances to meet under different circumstances, he'd choose her every time. Ayanna admits she has fallen in love with him too. They realize they would marry not because the government requires it, but because they love each other and have already chosen to be a family. 3 days later, Mary Catherine witnesses their wedding in the small-town church, attended by Marshal Torres, supportive neighbors, and church ladies won over by Ayanna's dignity. The Bradleys are notably absent, but their disapproval no longer matters. The story concludes by revealing that the Double M Ranch thrived in the years that followed, becoming known throughout the territory as both a successful cattle operation and an example of what's possible when people look past differences. Jake and Ayanna's marriage produced 3 bilingual, bicultural children, and they proved that real family is defined not by blood or race, but by the choice to stand together and build something lasting based on love and respect. In the end, Jake had bought a servant, but found a soulmate, while Ayanna was purchased as property, but chose to become the other half of a partnership that transformed both a struggling ranch and 2 lonely hearts into something neither could have imagined alone.